My dating track record has always been very, let's say, colorful. I know it's so typical for women to complain about attracting the creepsters, but despite the few nice ones peppered in here or there, you would think that I was a sadist, deliberately stooping lower and lower with each boyfriend. I started dating around the age of 14 despite the behest of my father, who truly only wanted what's best for me. He could be harsh with his words, but I knew it was out of love. After all, I wasn't just his only daughter. I was his only child as well. Luckily, the first boy I dated was very kind and actually got along well with my father. He even got gracefully handled in the cliche shotgun speech fathers are always very known for when letting their daughters date. However, I was 14, so it fizzled out quickly, leading to a tearful separation that, in hindsight, was not worth the tears. Throughout the rest of my high school, I dated frequently, but most relationships lasted much longer than 3 or 4 months. Despite the consistency in relationships, the quality of the relationships declined at an exponential rate. It started with the simple arguments over trivial things. Then came cheating, then came verbal abuse, then physical abuse, then psychosis, which tended to encompass all of the above. That was until I met Richard. I met Richard halfway through my last semester of high school, so just over a year ago. He was smart, funny, kind, and most importantly, he was a college boy. Something in the back of my mind told me that it was what made him so different than the rest. I had dated older boys well out of high school, but none of them with the intellectual prowess to make it in any form of higher education. When you're young and you've had many failed relationships, as I have, you begin to break down factors that contribute to the breakup and look for new factors in new men, hoping that one factor is going to be what makes the relationship work. His intelligence was my ticket to happiness. In hindsight, that feeling in the back of my head I previously mentioned was vastly misinterpreted. The kindness Richard showed me was a concept I had lost sight of over the years. I would spend hours each day reveling in the fact that he genuinely cared for me. He was prone to showing up with flowers, and when we went on dates, he listened. That was unheard of in my past relationships. I could talk to him for hours, and he would just sit there with the most sincere look on his face, like he truly cared about the things I had to say. Richard did have his quirks, and many of them weren't brought to light until several months into our relationship. Even then, those quirks weren't really necessary determinal to our relationship, and they certainly weren't harming me in any way. That was more than I could say for about my previous relationships, so I more or less dismissed them. The only one that particularly irked me was that Richard had an obsession with the occult. He never outright declared himself to be a Satanist or a worshiper of any evil or good spirit, but he had a fascination with reading up on pagan rituals. His doodles would often involve skulls and pentagrams, and he owned several books with covers so frightening that I couldn't stand to think what unpleasant images and ideas they housed. But still, I was in high school. I knew plenty of pseudo-Satanists with a love for the occult because it seemed like there was one in every 10 students. So it seemed easy for me to just dismiss this. I feel that it's more important for me to inform you that up until this point, I had never been with any of my boyfriends in a physical sense. I mentioned that in some of my relationships they were abusive. Fortunately for me, they never resulted in sexual abuse. The most recent boyfriend prior to Richard, Michael, had tried, but my father had come in and caught him in the act, sending him running with a lot less blood than he had showed up with. I tell you this because after a few months of dating Richard, I had come to a decision. Richard would be my first. And so it happened. I don't feel like going into detail about it because it's a little bit more private than I would prefer, and the details aren't necessary for the story. What is necessary to the story, however, is the way he acted after that. The way he changed. My God, did he change. At first, he became more possessive. Nothing physical, but definitely more clingy than he had been in the past. He would constantly inquire as to where I was, having to know where I was at all times. We lost our virginity to each other, so I interpreted this as mere affection, being concerned for my safety. It was almost sweet. What wasn't so sweet was the way he wanted to know more about my exes. His questions were vague at first, but one day we were sitting in his car outside my house when he just said to me, "So tell me about Jeff." Jeff was my first boyfriend. I had never told Richard his name. Panic overtook me as my cheeks turned fiery red and demanded how he knew his name. It was on your Facebook timeline. If you go back far enough, you can see each boy you were ever in a relationship with. All 12 of them, if I remember correctly. What he said to me made sense. I assumed you could go back and see that information, but it was pretty creepy that he had taken the time to go that far back. He could sense my alarm and tried to calm me. The last words he said as I opened his car door were such a faint whisper that I was amazed I could even hear him. What's even more eerie is that the voice didn't sound like his. It was deeper, with a more sinister tone that I had ever heard leave his lips. The voice said, "Here's to lucky number 13. Along with his curiosity for my love life, he also became more enthralled with the occult. Eventually, he would start sending me links to videos he would post, removing them soon after. The videos were almost always involved Richard wearing such odd clothing, definitely not from this century. He would dance around the room in such an odd way, almost mystical. More times than not, he would be dancing around in a pentagram and candles in his room. I assumed he was also sending these videos to his friends, as they also had an interest in the occult, but not to the same degree as Richard. I wrote the videos off, letting him have his fun. Like I said before, it wasn't harming me. Who was I to stop him? He continued to pry into my past, bringing up more exes, despite the fact that I was obviously a bit bothered by it. All of his questions and prying in, he was asking me one night, together in my room, "All those boys did so much wrong to you. They caused so much hurt in your life. If you had a chance to get back at them and make sure they never hurt anyone else again, would you?" People ask those questions all the time, and that's all they are, questions. But with Richard, I could see the room getting darker as he said it. I could feel the room get colder. I could hear the malevolence in his voice. This wasn't a question that was being asked just for the sake of asking. This was a question that I could tell he had already answered for himself. And I don't think that we were drawing the same conclusions. With that, I asked Richard to leave, telling him that I didn't feel right and I just needed to be alone for the night. I could tell this hurt him, and he objected every step of the way, but I finally convinced him to leave me for the night. I spent a week dwelling on the way that he had asked questions and how much it bothered me. That week ended with me calling him and telling him that I couldn't see him anymore. He yelled at me. He cried the whole conversation. He begged and pleaded, but I had made my decision. I couldn't keep seeing him, especially not after how scared I got the night he asked me about revenge on my exes. The last words he said to me didn't even seem to come from the phone as much as they did from all around me. I recognized it as the same voice I heard when getting out of his car weeks before. The voice said, "Number 13 won't be so lucky for you." Several weeks after the initial breakup, I hadn't heard a word from Richard, but I had started talking to Jeff again. It had been almost 4 years since we had dated, and we both had matured a lot. Most importantly, despite the fact that I had just ended a relationship, I didn't really want to be alone. I'll never forget my second first date with Jeff. Not that it was a great date. We went to dinner and it was fun, but nothing spectacular. The reason that night will be imprinted on my mind forever was because of the message I received from Richard halfway through the meal. Another link to a video. I ignored every bit of common sense in me telling me not to open it, or at least to wait, but I found myself opening the link on my phone right there in the restaurant. Just like his other videos, Richard was wearing those same strange, flamboyant clothes. The pentagram on the piece of plywood on the floor looked more wet than it ever had before, with the candlelight reflecting off of it. There wasn't much light outside of the many candles, so it was hard for me to make out what it was in the center of the pentagram. The longer I looked at it, the closer I came to making out what it was. It looked like a dead animal. Either a small dog or a large cat, or maybe something else entirely. The only thing I could say for certain was that it was dead. It didn't take me long to realize why the pentagram was much shinier than it had been before. Just like his previous videos, Richard started dancing around them. But this time, he chanted words as well. I didn't recognize them as any language. If anything, it sounded like he was speaking backwards. Given the circumstances, it wouldn't surprise me. But he almost spoke it too well, as if it wasn't actually him speaking the words. I managed to make out 12 of the words he was saying. I could understand them because they were the only ones that weren't spoken backwards. I could understand them because they were all the names of my 12 previous boyfriends. I continued watching as he danced his dance and spoke the names of my exes in the reverse order of which I dated them. I didn't realize how much of a trance I was in until Jeff snapped me out of it with his laughter. This video is hilarious. What a total lame ass. Do you know this guy? From there, I clued Jeff in on a lot of my past with Richard and how much he had inquired into my previous relationships. He took it well, but I could tell that the man in the video being Richard made it much more real to him, and he definitely didn't find it as funny. That was a month ago, and it had been almost a month of hell, a month of death. The first one I heard about from a mutual friend. The ex I had dated before Richard had gotten into a bar fight with a drunk and ended up getting his throat slit with a broken bottle. It was startling news, but I didn't find anything particularly ominous about it, especially considering that they even arrested the guy who did it. He claimed to not remember having done it, but he was drunk and it was a bar fight. It made sense. The second wasn't as subtle. My third most recent boyfriend had always been a happy attitude and never seemed at all that upset. We only broke up because he got a little too happy with another girl. That's why it came as a shock to me that he had decided to walk off a curb in front of a speeding bus. I am not an idiot. I can recognize a pattern when I see one. I continued to see Jeff as I expressed my concern. Unfortunately, Jeff didn't agree. He didn't know Richard like I did. He didn't experience the few scary moments I had with Richard to justify the acknowledging a pattern. To him, it was just a mere coincidence. To me, it was obvious. I tried at least once a day to call Richard, at least. His phone always went straight to voicemail, and his voicemail hadn't been set up. I could have confronted him at home, but I was far too terrified to make the venture, even if Jeff would be by my side. Then, tonight it happened. Tonight is the reason I'm recording this. Tonight will be the end of this one way or another. Jeff and I had gone out to a late night afternoon showing of the new Star Trek movie. It was dark by the time we got back to my house, and my paranoia about Richard hadn't fully subsided, despite the fact that none of my other exes had died in weeks. So I invited Jeff inside. The car in the driveway indicated that my dad was home, and he still wasn't keen on boys coming inside the house, so I had Jeff park a few houses down. We walked to the side of the house and climbed through my bedroom window. As I shut the window, I heard a loud crash coming from the other side of the house. Worried that my dad might have hurt himself, I decided to go check on the noise. I told Jeff to stay put in my room. My dad may be hurt, but I still didn't want him knowing that I had a boy in the house. As I walked down the hallway, I could see a light coming from the dining room. As I rounded the entrance to the room, I saw something that I'll never forget so long as I live. Seated in chairs around the dining table were the remaining 10 X's. Their hands and legs were tied tightly to the chairs, 5 on each side of the table. It took a moment to register. There should have only been 9 people. 2 X's were dead, and 1 was Jeff, who was in my room. That leaves 9 X's, but 10 chairs were occupied. That's when I slowly realized that the 10th chair was filled by my own father. At the head, Richard sat at the table with an enormous axe resting on the table in front of him. He drummed his fingers on the handle as I slowly took in the scene. Each of the men, even my father, had their heads facing up at the ceiling, a distorted look of terror on each of their faces. Below their chin had a gaping hole where the axe had been driven multiple times into their necks, the blood pouring down, staining their clothes, and the chair beneath them. It wasn't until then that I had noticed the pentagram drawn in their blood on the table. As the initial shock wore off, I finally found it in me to let out a loud scream of pure terror. My own father was in front of me, dead. Men that I had bared my soul to, had shared my life with, and had called my own, now lay lifeless before me. I could hear ringing in my ears as the blood rushed to my head, and I had noticed Jeff coming up beside me in my peripheral vision. He was rendered speechless, just like I had been at first. Before he could register his own shock, Richard broke the silence. You know, the other 2 were fun and all, but I really didn't get the hands-on experience I wanted. Not like I did with these other guys. I just had to take it on myself to speed up the process a little bit. Besides, I'm not even done. I've still got one little Jeff to take care of, don't I? He arose from the chair at the exact moment that Jeff and I both realized it was time to run. We both headed straight for the door, but it was jammed shut. We immediately hightailed it down the hallway, and as I turned, I realized out of the corner of my eye that Richard wasn't running. He was walking, axe in hand, walking with an air of confidence, walking as if he knew that he didn't need to run. We weren't going to escape no matter what. Lost in panic, Jeff and I ended at the bottom of the stairs that led to the basement. I'm really not sure why it seemed like the most impractical place to run, but we couldn't risk turning around. We burst through the door, and Jeff immediately grabbed the first chair in sight to jam it against the door. I could hear Richard walking above us, dragging the axe blade against the hardwood floors and the walls, screaming at the top of his lungs. "You are the one for me, not them!" He slammed the axe against the floor. "I never wanted to give you up!" He slammed it again. "I wasn't going to desert you like they did." His slamming was getting closer. "And I was never going to hurt you just like them." He slammed the axe out right outside the basement door. Jeff pointed to a small window near the ceiling of the basement. He got up on the table beneath it and broke it open with his elbow, shards of glass peppering his skin and ground outside. He hoisted me up and through the window. I was so scared for my life that I had hardly noticed the jagged edges of the window tearing into my skin. I pulled Jeff up and out of the window just as Richard bursted through the basement door. I heard him swear to himself as he ran for the truck and sped away from the house. I don't think he could have followed us to the motel. Even if he took a car, we didn't see anyone following us out onto the highway to the next town. Still, I can't help but to fear that he knows where I'm at, especially because he just texted me a link to one of his other videos. He's still wearing those clothes, still dancing that dance. I've never been so scared.